The message came through every communication channel across the galaxy at once. Emergency broadcasts pierced through hyperspace networks, quantum entanglement communicators, and even primitive radio waves. The signal was desperate, chaotic, and broadcast in over 3,000 different languages. Ambassador Zixthala of the Galactic Council stood before the massive holographic display in the emergency session chamber. Her 6 arms trembled as she read the translation scrolling across the screen. Around her, representatives from dozens of species sat in stunned silence. "The Void Hunters have returned," she announced, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Outer Rim colonies are already gone. Kepler Station, New Centauri, the entire Vega system, nothing but empty space remains." A collective shudder ran through the assembly. The Void Hunters were legends, nightmares told to young beings across the galaxy, ancient creatures that consumed entire worlds, leaving nothing behind but cosmic dust. Most believed they were myths, stories created to explain unexplained disappearances of planets and stars. "How many survivors?" asked Commander Threx, his reptilian features pale with fear. "None," Zixthala replied. "The Hunters don't leave survivors. They consume everything. Matter, energy, even the electromagnetic signatures of life itself." The chamber erupted in panicked chatter. Species that had been enemies for centuries suddenly found themselves united in terror. The proud Zenthran Empire, known for their military might, admitted their fleets had been reduced to scattered atoms within minutes of engagement. The technological marvels of the synthetic collective proved useless against an enemy that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of physics. "What about the defense stations?" inquired Dr. Milani, the insectoid representative from the hive worlds. "Consumed," came the reply. "Even our most powerful weapons barely scratched them. They absorb energy attacks and use them to grow stronger. Physical projectiles pass right through them as if they don't exist." As the reports continued, a pattern emerged that chilled every being in the chamber. The Void Hunters were not just destroying randomly. They were moving in a calculated pattern, consuming the most advanced civilizations first, working their way through the galaxy like a plague of cosmic locusts. "We need to evacuate the core worlds," declared High Admiral Corvin of the United Fleet. "Pull back our forces, establish a perimeter around the galactic center." "And then what?" Zixthala's voice cracked with desperation. "We've tried everything. Our most advanced weapons, our greatest military minds, our most sophisticated technology. Nothing works. They're not just defeating us, they're erasing us from existence." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in galactic history, the combined might of thousands of civilizations felt powerless. They had conquered diseases, tamed black holes, built cities that spanned solar systems, but against the Void Hunters, they were as helpless as primitive creatures hiding from a storm. "There has to be something," whispered Dr. Melanie. "Some weapon we haven't tried, some technology we haven't developed." "Actually," came a hesitant voice from the back of the chamber, "there might be." All eyes turned to researcher Quinn, a young academic from the archive worlds. She rarely spoke in these gatherings, preferring to observe and record rather than participate in politics. "Explain," ordered Zixthala. Quinn's hands shook as she activated her portable display. Ancient symbols and faded star charts appeared in the air above the assembly. "I've been studying the old records, the ones from before the Great Expansion. There are references to a species that fought the Void Hunters before, thousands of years ago. They called themselves humans. And according to these texts, they didn't just fight the Hunters. They won." Laughter erupted from several representatives. The idea seemed absurd. How could one primitive species succeed where the combined might of the galaxy had failed? "This is fantasy," scoffed Admiral Corvin. "Ancient mythology trying to give us hope where none exists." But Quinn pressed on, her confidence growing as she shared her research. "The records are fragmented, but they're consistent across multiple independent sources. The humans came from a world so hostile that it created warriors unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They called their planet Earth and described it as a death world, where everything was designed to kill." "Even if such beings existed," interrupted Commander Threx, "where are they now? Why haven't we encountered them in all our explorations?" "Because they disappeared," Quinn replied quietly. "Right after the war with the Void Hunters ended. Some records suggest they went into hiding, retreating to the dark spaces between stars. Others claim they evolved beyond physical form. But the most interesting entries suggest they're still out there, watching, waiting. The chamber fell silent again as the implications sank in. If these humans were real, if they had actually defeated the Void Hunters before, then they represented the galaxy's only hope for survival. "How do we find them?" asked Zixathala. Quinn highlighted a section of the ancient star chart. The records mention a signal, a way to call for their help. But it comes with a warning. Summoning the humans means accepting that they will exact a price for their aid. The text described them as honorable but ruthless, compassionate but terrifying. "What kind of price?" demanded Admiral Corvin. "Unknown," Quinn admitted. "The records are too damaged to be clear, but given the alternative is extinction, perhaps we should consider it." As if summoned by their conversation, an aide rushed into the chamber with an urgent communication pad. His face was white with terror. "The hunters have reached the middle rim," he announced. "They've consumed the Arcturus system, all 17 planets. At their current rate of advance, they'll reach the core worlds within 3 standard months." The weight of impending doom settled over the assembly like a funeral shroud. Civilizations that had existed for millions of years faced complete annihilation. Everything they had built, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every life they had cherished, would be consumed and forgotten. "Send the signal." Zixthala's voice cut through the despair with sudden authority. "Whatever the cost, we have no choice. Send the signal and pray that these humans, if they exist, still remember how to fight." As the chamber erupted in desperate activity, preparing to broadcast humanity's ancient calling code into the void, none of them noticed the small monitoring device that had been silently observing their meeting. In a hidden facility light years away, figures emerged from shadows that had concealed them for millennia and began to prepare for war. The signal traveled through space for 7 days before it reached its destination, deep in the Kuiper belt of an unremarkable star system. Hidden within what appeared to be nothing more than cosmic debris, something stirred. Captain Sarah Chen was reviewing tactical reports when the alert chimed through the command center of Sanctuary Station. The massive facility, disguised as an asteroid field, had been humanity's secret home for over 3,000 years. Around her, dozens of humans worked at stations that would have seemed like magic to the younger species of the galaxy. "Captain," called Lieutenant Rodriguez from the communications array. "We're receiving the old frequency, the one from the archives." Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. In 3 millennia, that frequency had never been used. It was a relic from the old days when humanity had walked openly among the stars before the Great Withdrawal. "Are you certain?" she asked, setting down her cup with deliberate care. "Positive, ma'am. It's the Council's emergency beacon, broadcasting the plea protocols from the First War." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had hoped this day would never come, that the younger races would be strong enough to handle their own problems. But deep down she had always known the Void Hunters would return. "Patch me through to Admiral Morrison," she ordered. Within minutes, the grizzled face of Admiral James Morrison appeared on the main screen. Despite being over 200 years old thanks to genetic enhancements developed during the war, he looked no older than 60. His eyes carried the weight of battles that most beings couldn't imagine. "I take it you received the signal too?" Morrison's voice was steady, professional. "All monitoring stations reported it," Sarah confirmed. "The Void Hunters are back and the Council is requesting aid." Morrison rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "How long do we have?" "Intelligence suggests 3 months before they reach the core worlds. But given their acceleration pattern, probably less." "Recommendations?" Sarah pulled up a holographic display showing the galaxy's current state. Red zones marked areas already consumed by the hunters, while yellow indicated imminent danger zones. The amount of red was staggering. "Full mobilization," she said without hesitation. "This isn't a limited engagement like the border skirmishes we've handled quietly over the centuries. This is another extinction event." Morrison nodded grimly. "I was afraid you'd say that. Very well. Initiate Protocol 7. Wake the fleets." Across human space, which existed in the hidden places the younger races had never found, ancient systems came online. Massive shipyards that had been dormant for millennia began their startup sequences. Generation ships that had been running skeleton crews suddenly bustled with activity as their populations were awakened from extended hibernation. On Haven Prime, humanity's true capital world, President Elena Vasquez stood before the Global Assembly. The chamber was smaller than the Galactic Council's meeting hall, but the beings within it commanded power that dwarfed anything the younger races possessed. "The call has come," she announced simply. "After 3,000 years of peace, the Void Hunters have returned to threaten our galaxy." Unlike the panic that had gripped the Galactic Council, the human assembly received this news with calm determination. They had been preparing for this possibility their entire lives, trained from childhood in the arts of war their ancestors had perfected. "What's the strategic situation?" asked General Patterson, head of the Terra Defense Corps. "Grim," replied Intelligence Director Walsh, activating a detailed tactical display. "Preliminary reports suggest the hunters have evolved since our last encounter. They're consuming matter faster, moving more efficiently, and their resistance to conventional weapons appears to have improved. Conventional weapons were never effective against them anyway," noted Dr. Yamato from the Advanced Weapons Division. "That's why we developed the resonance technology." Speaking of which, President Vasquez turned to face the scientist. "What's the status of our special weapons programs?" "The Voidbreaker missiles are ready for deployment. The quantum disruptor network is operational, and the Stellar Forge protocols have been updated with everything we learned from the First War." Dr. Yamato paused. "However, we should prepare for the possibility that the hunters have adapted to our previous tactics." General Patterson stood, his uniform bearing decorations from conflicts the galactic community had never heard of. "Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to deploy the First Fleet immediately. If the hunters are moving as fast as reports suggest, we'll need to establish forward positions soon." "Granted," the President replied. "But remember, we're not just fighting for humanity this time. The entire galaxy is depending on us." As the assembly dispersed to begin humanity's largest military mobilization in 3 millennia, few of them dwelled on the irony of their situation. The species that had voluntarily exiled itself from galactic civilization to prevent another devastating war was now the only hope for that same civilization's survival. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, the first human scout ships were already moving. These vessels, black as the void and virtually undetectable, began shadowing the Void Hunters' advance. Their crews were volunteers from humanity's most elite units, individuals who had trained their entire lives for missions that might require the ultimate sacrifice. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb watched through his ship's sensors as a hunter consumed what had once been a thriving colony world. The process was as horrific as the archives described. The creature, if it could be called that, was a writhing mass of dark energy that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. As it fed, the planet simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed but unmade, as if it had never been. "Getting full scans," reported his sensor operator, Specialist Kim. "The hunter's energy signature matches archive data, but it's significantly more powerful than the ones our grandparents fought." "Any sign it's detected us?" Webb asked. "Negative, sir. Stealth systems are holding." Webb nodded, but his jaw was tight with concentration. The Void Hunters had always been difficult to hide from, possessing senses that operated beyond the normal electromagnetic spectrum. If they were becoming more powerful, human stealth technology might not remain effective much longer. "Continue monitoring," he ordered, "and prep a courier drone for immediate transmission. Command needs to know what we're dealing with." As Webb's ship maintained its silent vigil, similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy. Dozens of human scout ships were gathering intelligence on an enemy that had once brought their species to the brink of extinction. The data they collected would determine whether humanity's 3,000-year preparation had been sufficient, or whether they would need to unlock weapons so terrible that they had hoped never to use them again. The message that reached the Galactic Council 12 hours later was brief, but carried weight that made several representatives collapse in relief. "This is Admiral Morrison of the Human Defense Fleet. We have received your distress. Call and are responding. Maintain defensive positions around your core worlds. Help is coming." For the first time since the crisis began, there was hope. But in the dark spaces between stars, ancient enemies stirred, and the galaxy held its breath as two legendary forces prepared to clash once more. The first human ship to make contact with the Galactic Council appeared without warning in the middle of their emergency session. One moment, the council chamber was filled with the panicked chatter of desperate species planning their evacuation. The next, a sleek vessel materialized directly above their assembly, having somehow bypassed every security system and defense grid surrounding the station. Ambassador Zixathala nearly fell from her floating platform as alarms began shrieking throughout the complex. The ship above them was unlike anything in their databases. Its hull seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving it an almost predatory appearance that made her instincts scream warnings. "Unknown vessel, you are in violation of Council space." Admiral Corvin's voice boomed through the communication system, though it trembled slightly. "Identify yourself immediately." The response came not through their communication channels but directly into their minds. Every being in the chamber heard the words in their own language, as if the speaker was standing beside them. "I am Colonel David Kane, representing the Human Defense Fleet. I'm here because you asked for help." The chamber fell silent. After all the ancient legends and desperate hopes, humanity had actually answered their call. But the being who materialized on their platform, via some form of teleportation technology they didn't recognize, was not what any of them had expected. Colonel Kane appeared to be a perfectly ordinary human male, perhaps 40 years old by their appearance standards. He wore a simple black uniform with minimal decoration and carried no visible weapons. But there was something in his eyes, an intensity that made even the battle-hardened representatives uncomfortable. It was the gaze of a predator that had never known defeat. "You're smaller than I expected," Admiral Corvin said, attempting to maintain his composure. Kane smiled. And somehow that expression was more unsettling than any threat would have been. "We usually are. It's not the size that matters, Admiral. It's what you do with it. Our records suggest your species fought the Void Hunters before," Zixathala managed to say. "Is this true?" "We didn't just fight them," Kane replied, walking calmly around the circular platform as if he owned it. "We broke them so completely that they fled to the edge of the universe and spent 3,000 years rebuilding. The fact that they're back suggests they either think we're gone or they believe they found a way to defeat us. And have they?" Dr. Milani's chittering voice carried barely concealed terror. Kane stopped walking and looked directly at her. His eyes seemed to pierce through her compound visual organs and examine her soul. "That remains to be seen. But I can tell you this. We've spent 3 millennia preparing for their return. Every human born since the First War has been trained for this moment. We've developed weapons that would horrify you, tactics that would make you question our sanity, and a willingness to sacrifice everything to ensure they never threaten this galaxy again." "What do you need from us?" asked Zixathala honestly. "Stay out of our way." Kane's bluntness shocked them. "Your fleets, your weapons, your strategies, they're all based on conventional warfare against conventional enemies. The Void Hunters aren't conventional. They exist partially outside our reality. They consume energy as sustenance, and they treat the laws of physics as suggestions rather than rules." Commander Threx bristled at the dismissal. "Our combined forces represent billions of ships and trillions of soldiers. Surely we can provide some assistance." Kane's expression softened slightly, showing what might have been sympathy. "Commander, I mean no disrespect to your courage, but in the First War, the combined galactic fleet was consumed in the first 6 hours of engagement. Not defeated, consumed. The Hunters used your own ship's energy signatures to grow stronger and multiply faster. The silence that followed was crushing. The representatives began to understand just how helpless they truly were against this threat. However," Kane continued, "there are ways you can help. We'll need staging areas for our fleets, supply lines for extended operations, and most importantly, evacuation routes for civilian populations in the battle zones." "You expect civilians to be involved?" Zixathala asked, horrified. "The Hunters don't distinguish between military and civilian targets," Kane explained. "To them, all life is food. But our strategy requires drawing them into specific engagement zones, which means some systems will become battlefields. We'll do everything possible to minimize casualties, but this is war on a galactic scale. There will be losses." As if summoned by his words, alerts began streaming through the chamber's communication systems. Outer Rim scouts were reporting massive hunter movement, dozens of the creatures accelerating toward the Middle Rim worlds at unprecedented speeds. Kane touched a device on his wrist, and his expression hardened. "They know we're here. The Hunters can sense human presence across interstellar distances. Our arrival has provoked them into accelerating their timeline." "Is that good or bad?" asked Dr. Milani. "Both," Kane replied grimly. "Good because it forces them into a pattern we can predict and counter. Bad because it means we have hours instead of days to implement our strategy." The colonel moved to the center of the platform and raised his voice to address the entire assembly. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted beings of the Galactic Council, I need you to understand something fundamental about what's coming. You've spent centuries building a civilization based on cooperation, diplomacy, and mutual benefit. Those are admirable qualities that we hope to preserve. But for the next few weeks, you're going to witness humanity at war, and it may disturb you. What do you mean? Admiral Corvin asked. Kane's smile returned, cold as the void between stars. We come from a world where everything was designed to kill us. Predators, diseases, weather, even the plants were poisonous. We survived by becoming the most dangerous thing on our planet. When we reached the stars, we discovered that the galaxy was no different from Earth. It was simply a larger ecosystem with bigger predators. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. The Void Hunters are apex predators in this galactic ecosystem. They've never encountered anything that could challenge them, anything that could hunt them in return. That's about to change. Kane touched his wrist device again, and suddenly the chamber's displays lit up with tactical information that made several representatives gasp. The scale of the human military response was staggering. Fleets that dwarfed their combined navies were already moving into position, armed with weapons whose energy signatures registered as impossible according to known physics. The first engagement will occur in the Rigel sector in approximately 6 hours, Kane announced. I recommend evacuating all civilian traffic from that region immediately. What happens there will determine the course of this war. As Kane prepared to leave, Zixthala found her voice one last time. Colonel, your people withdrew from galactic civilization 3,000 years ago. Why help us now? What do humans gain from this? Kane stopped at the edge of the platform and looked back at her. For just a moment, his predatory composure cracked, revealing something unexpectedly human underneath. Because despite your flaws, despite your naivety, despite the fact that you'll probably make the same mistakes that led to this situation in the first place, this galaxy is worth saving. And because no matter how far we travel or how long we live, Earth is still our home. And these are still our neighbors. With that, he vanished, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ozone and the promise that the galaxy was about to witness the return of its most terrifying protectors. The Battle of Rigel began exactly 6 hours after Colonel Kane's departure, and it shattered everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare. Admiral Corvin watched from the safety of the Council's long-range observation platform as human ships engaged the first wave of Void Hunters. What he witnessed defied every tactical principle he had studied in his centuries of military service. The human fleet was smaller than he expected, barely 300 ships compared to the thousands the Council could have mustered. But these vessels moved with a coordination that seemed impossible. They flowed through space like schools of fish, each ship anticipating not just the enemy's movements but their own allies' actions several steps ahead. How are they doing that? Whispered Dr. Milani, her compound eyes tracking patterns that her analytical mind couldn't quite process. Neural linking, came a new voice from behind them. They turned to see a human woman in a white uniform, her hair streaked with silver despite her relatively young appearance. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, tactical coordinator for this operation. Colonel Kane thought you might want to witness humanity at war. Neural linking. Admiral Corvin repeated the unfamiliar term. Every human in our fleet shares a quantum-entangled neural network, Dr. Chen explained casually, as if describing the weather. In combat, we don't just fight as individuals or even as crews. We fight as a single organism with hundreds of bodies. On the display, the first Void Hunter had reached the human perimeter. The creature was massive, easily the size of a small moon, its dark energy tentacles reaching across thousands of kilometers. The Council representatives had seen recordings of what happened when their own fleets engaged such beings. Ships were consumed instantly, their energy absorbed to make the Hunter stronger. But when the human ships opened fire, something different happened. The weapons they used didn't appear on any database of galactic armaments. Instead of energy beams or projectile weapons, they seemed to fire. Nothingness. Streams of absolute void that made the Hunter's own darkness look bright by comparison. What are those weapons? Zixthala asked, her 6 arms trembling as she watched. Entropy cannons, Dr. Chen replied matter-of-factly. They accelerate the natural decay of matter at the quantum level. Instead of adding energy to the Hunter, they drain it. The effect on the Void Hunter was immediate and terrifying. The creature, which had shrugged off the combined firepower of entire fleets, began to shrivel and collapse as the entropy field struck it. Its tentacles withered, its core contracted, and within minutes what had been an unstoppable force of consumption was reduced to scattered particles of inert matter. But the humans weren't finished. As the first hunter died, more appeared from the depths of space, dozens of them moving in the coordinated pattern that had allowed them to consume entire star systems. The council representatives expected the human fleet to retreat or at least regroup. Instead, they attacked. "This is insane," Admiral Corvin muttered as he watched human ships deliberately fly into the midst of the hunter swarm. "They're outnumbered 20 to 1. "Numbers don't matter when you're fighting a different kind of war," Dr. Chen observed. "Watch." The human vessels began to dance between the hunters with impossible precision. They moved not just in 3 dimensions, but seemed to slip partially out of normal space-time, becoming translucent for moments before solidifying in new positions. Their entropy weapons fired in sequences that created cascading effects, each shot precisely timed to amplify the damage of the previous one. But it was their defensive strategy that truly shocked the observers. When hunter tentacles reached for human ships instead of trying to avoid them, the humans allowed contact. The moment a hunter touched a human vessel, the ship's hull began to glow with a pale light that spread along the creature's appendage like an infection. "What's that light?" Dr. Milani asked. "Life force," Dr. Chen answered simply. "Concentrated, weaponized life energy. The hunters consume death and entropy. Life force is poison to them." The council representatives watched in stunned silence as hunter after hunter was destroyed by this biological warfare they couldn't comprehend. The creatures began to retreat, but the humans pursued relentlessly, their ships moving with a hunger that matched their prey's. "My God," whispered Commander Threx, "you've turned yourselves into anti-hunters." "We had 3,000 years to evolve," Dr. Chen replied. "Every generation of humanity has been shaped by the knowledge that we would face this enemy again. We've become what we needed to become." As the last hunter in the immediate area was destroyed, the human fleet began to regroup. But instead of celebrating their victory, they immediately began deploying strange devices throughout the battlefield. "Quantum mines," Dr. Chen explained before anyone could ask. "They'll detect and destroy any hunter that tries to feed on the energy residue from this battle." We learned in the First War that hunters often return to consume the battlefield itself. Admiral Corvin found his voice with difficulty. "How many more battles like this will it take?" Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "This was just a probe. The main hunter force is still gathering at the galactic edge. We estimate several thousand individuals, possibly more. Some of them are significantly larger and more powerful than what we face today." "Can you defeat them all?" Sixthala asked. "That depends on how much they've learned about us," Dr. Chen admitted. "The hunters are ancient and intelligent. They've had 3,000 years to study their defeat and develop countermeasures. We've prepared for that possibility, but..." She trailed off as new alerts began streaming through the communication system. Deep space monitors were detecting massive movement at the galaxy's edge. The main hunter force was beginning to advance, and their numbers were beyond anything the ancient records had described. "How many?" Admiral Corvin asked quietly. Dr. Chen's face was grim as she reviewed the incoming data. "Approximately 10,000 individual hunters with 17 identified as Apex class, beings capable of consuming entire star systems in hours." The silence that followed was deafening. Even after witnessing humanity's impossible victory, the scale of what they faced seemed overwhelming. "We'll need to evacuate the outer territories," Dr. Chen continued. "My government is implementing Protocol Omega, our most extreme defensive strategy. Every civilian population in the potential combat zone needs to be relocated to the galactic core within the next 72 hours. "That's impossible," Admiral Corvin protested. "We're talking about trillions of beings across thousands of worlds. Then we'll save who we can," Dr. Chen replied with quiet determination. "And we'll make the hunters pay dearly for every life they take." As she prepared to return to her ship, Zixthala called out to her. "Dr. Chen, what is Protocol Omega?" The human woman paused at the edge of the observation deck, her back to them. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the air itself seem heavy. "It's the strategy we hoped we'd never have to use. If the standard tactics fail, if the hunters prove too numerous or too evolved, then we implement the final option. We turn this galaxy into a weapon itself." She vanished in a shimmer of transported energy. leaving the council representatives alone with their thoughts and the growing realization that they were about to witness a war that would reshape the very nature of their existence. In the depths of space, the Hunter Armada continued its advance, ancient minds calculating new strategies against an enemy that had dared to evolve specifically to destroy them. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just the fate of galactic civilization, but the fundamental balance between life and entropy itself. The evacuation of the Outer Territories became the largest humanitarian operation in galactic history, and it revealed the true scope of humanity's hidden influence across the galaxy. Sixathala stood on the bridge of the refugee transport ship New Hope, watching in amazement as the evacuation proceeded with impossible efficiency. Massive human vessels, each capable of carrying entire cities, appeared at colony worlds with precise timing. But what shocked her most was how many species already knew the evacuation protocols. "How is this possible?" she asked Captain Martinez, the human officer coordinating the operation in her sector. These colonies received detailed evacuation instructions within minutes of the alert. Some of them were already beginning to evacuate before your ships arrived. Captain Martinez smiled grimly. "We never really left, Ambassador. When humanity withdrew from galactic politics 3,000 years ago, we didn't abandon our responsibility to our neighbors. We've been watching, helping, guiding from the shadows ever since." As if to prove his point, the view screen showed a seemingly empty region of space suddenly filled with ships, dozens of human vessels decloaked, their stealth technology finally revealed to the galaxy at large. They had been there all along. Invisible guardians protecting trade routes, monitoring for threats, quietly intervening in conflicts before they could escalate. "You've been here the entire time," Zixthala whispered, understanding dawning in her mind. The mysterious resolution of the Centauri border war, the plague cure that appeared just when the Vegan colonies needed it, the asteroid that mysteriously changed course before it could strike Kepler Prime. "Humanity has a saying," Captain Martinez replied. "The price of freedom is eternal vigilance." We took that responsibility seriously, but we learned from our mistakes. Direct involvement in galactic politics led to the wars that almost destroyed everything. So we found subtler ways to help. Their conversation was interrupted by urgent communications from the fleet. The Hunter advance had accelerated beyond all projections. Instead of the predicted 72 hours, they had perhaps 18 before the first major engagement. "All ships. This is Admiral Morrison." The fleet commander's voice echoed through every vessel in the evacuation fleet. "Intelligence reports indicate the Hunters have adapted faster than anticipated. They're using some form of dark energy manipulation to accelerate their movement through space. ETA to the Centaurus sector is now 16 hours. Captain Martinez cursed under his breath. "That's not possible. We have 12 billion refugees still in the evacuation zone. Can't your ships move faster?" Zixathala asked desperately. "We're already pushing the engines beyond safe limits," Martinez replied. "But there's too many people and not enough time." As if the universe itself was responding to their desperation, new signals began appearing on the sensor screens. Ships unlike anything in the galactic databases were emerging from hyperspace across the evacuation zone. They were clearly human in design but ancient, their hulls scarred by millennia of warfare. Ghost Fleet Alpha reporting for evacuation duty, came a transmission that made Captain Martinez's eyes widen in shock. "We have room for 8 million refugees per vessel." "Ghost Fleet?" Zixthala asked. "Generation ships from the First War," Martinez whispered in awe. "We thought they were lost in the deep void. They've been out there for 3,000 years preparing for this day." The massive vessels, each the size of a small moon, began coordinating with the modern evacuation fleet. Their technology was ancient but proven. Their crews composed of humans who had never known peace, raised in the depths of space specifically to fight the Void Hunters. As the evacuation accelerated, disturbing reports began filtering in from the outer rim. The first probing attacks by individual hunters weren't random as previously believed. They were strategic strikes designed to study human tactics and defenses. "They're learning," reported Dr. Chen from her command ship. "Each engagement they adapt their approach. The entropy weapons are becoming less effective, and they're developing countermeasures to our life force defenses." Admiral Morrison's face appeared on screens throughout the fleet, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen, the tactical situation has fundamentally changed. The hunters aren't just more numerous than in the first war, they're more intelligent. They've spent 3 millennia studying us just as we've been studying them. He paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. Intelligence reports that the main hunter force has begun implementing new tactics. They're sending smaller groups ahead to test our responses, then adapting their approach based on what they learn. We're facing an enemy that learns from every engagement. Captain Martinez turned to Zixathala, his expression troubled. This changes everything. Our entire strategy was based on the assumption that they would fight the same way they did 3,000 years ago. What does this mean for the evacuation? Zixathala asked. Before Martinez could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. Long-range sensors were detecting massive energy signatures approaching the evacuation zone. The hunters had abandoned their methodical advance and were moving directly toward the largest concentration of refugee ships. They're targeting the evacuation fleet. Dr. Chen's voice came through the communication system, tight with barely controlled panic. Somehow they've identified our evacuation routes and are moving to intercept. ETA to contact. 4 hours. The bridge fell silent as the full horror of the situation became clear. The hunters weren't just adapting their combat tactics, they had learned to think strategically. By threatening the evacuation fleet, they were forcing humanity into an impossible choice: engage in a premature battle to protect civilians, or abandon billions of refugees to save their military forces for the final confrontation. All combat vessels. This is Admiral Morrison. The fleet commander's voice cut through the silence. Prepare for emergency deployment. We're moving to intercept the hunter force. Sir, came Dr. Chen's response. The fleet isn't in position yet. If we engage now, we'll be fighting at a significant disadvantage. I'm aware of the tactical situation, Doctor, Morrison replied grimly, but we're not going to sacrifice 12 billion civilians to maintain our strategic advantage. Humanity didn't survive this long by abandoning those who needed protection. As the human battle fleet began to accelerate toward the approaching hunters, Zixathala found herself witnessing something that would forever change her understanding of these mysterious humans. Instead of fear or resignation, the crews displayed a calm determination that seemed almost supernatural. Aren't you afraid? She asked Captain Martinez as his ship prepared to join the battle fleet. Martinez considered the question seriously before answering. Fear is a luxury we gave up long ago, Ambassador. When you grow up knowing that you might be humanity's last generation, when you're raised from birth to face an enemy that treats existence itself as food, fear becomes irrelevant. He gestured toward the approaching hunter signatures on the tactical display. Those things represent entropy itself, the end of everything we've ever built or hoped to build. But they made one crucial mistake 3,000 years ago. What mistake? Zixathala asked. They left us alive, Martinez replied, his voice carrying a cold certainty that made her shiver. And in doing so, they gave us time to become something they've never encountered before. Prey that evolved specifically to hunt predators. As the human fleet moved to engage the hunters, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. The main hunter force had split into multiple groups, each targeting a different strategic objective. Some were moving toward heavily populated core worlds, others toward critical infrastructure systems, and the largest group was heading directly for the Galactic Council itself. It's a coordinated assault, Dr. Chen reported to Admiral Morrison. They're not just trying to consume the galaxy, they're trying to break our will to resist by targeting everything we're trying to protect simultaneously. Morrison's response was immediate and decisive. Then we'll show them what humanity learned on Earth. When you're surrounded by predators, you don't survive by hiding. You survive by becoming the apex predator yourself. As the first human ships engaged the hunter vanguard, space itself seemed to warp around the battle. The humans had deployed weapons that existed at the very edge of known physics, technologies that they had hoped never to use. Reality bent and twisted as entropy weapons clashed with dark energy manipulation, creating phenomena that the galaxy's greatest scientists couldn't explain. But in the depths of the hunter swarm, something else was stirring. Ancient minds that had consumed countless galaxies were beginning to recognize a pattern they had never encountered before. For the first time in their existence spanning eons, the Void Hunters were facing an enemy that might actually be capable of destroying them completely. The stage was set for a battle that would determine not just the fate of one galaxy, but the fundamental balance between creation and destruction in the universe itself. The Battle of Seven Systems became the largest military engagement in galactic history, fought simultaneously across multiple star systems as humanity faced the full might of the evolved Void Hunters. Ambassador Zixathala watched from the command deck of the refugee ship as space around them erupted in conflicts that defied comprehension. The Hunters had indeed learned from their previous defeat, deploying tactics that neutralized many of humanity's advantages. But what shocked her most was humanity's response to this adaptation. They had been expecting it. Phase 2 protocols are now in effect. Admiral Morrison's voice echoed across the human fleet with calm authority. All ships implement variable reality warfare. Zixathala turned to Captain Martinez, who was coordinating the civilian evacuation while monitoring the battle. Variable reality warfare? Martinez's expression was grim as he watched the tactical displays. Something we developed as a contingency in case the Hunters learned to counter our standard weapons. If you can't change the enemy, you change the battlefield itself. On the screens around them, human ships began to deploy devices that looked deceptively simple compared to their advanced weaponry. But as these devices activated, space itself began to behave differently around them. Physical laws that had governed the universe for billions of years suddenly became negotiable. In the Centaurus system, human ships found themselves able to exist in multiple positions simultaneously, confusing hunter targeting systems that couldn't track enemies that were literally everywhere and nowhere at once. In the Vega sector, human weapons began firing ammunition that traveled backward through time, striking hunters before the triggers were pulled. How is this possible? Zixathala whispered, watching reality bend around the battle. We learned something important about the Hunters during the First War, Martinez explained. They exist partially outside normal spacetime. That's how they consume matter so efficiently and resist conventional weapons. But we realized that if they can operate outside physical laws, then in their presence, those laws become flexible for everyone. The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't just developed weapons to fight the Hunters. They had learned to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality itself in the presence of beings that existed beyond normal physics. But the Hunters were adapting even to this. Reports flooded in from across the battle zones as the creatures began to implement countermeasures that no one had anticipated. Some Hunters started phasing completely out of normal reality, becoming untouchable by any weapon. Others began replicating themselves, creating multiple copies that each possessed the original's devastating power. Sir, Dr. Chen's voice cut through the communication channels, tight with urgency. Hunter Alpha 7 has just demonstrated the ability to consume energy directly from stars. It's draining the Rigel system's primary star to fuel its replication process. The tactical display showed the horrifying truth. One of the largest hunters had positioned itself near Rigel's sun and was drawing stellar energy directly into itself. As it fed, copies of itself began appearing throughout the system, each one as powerful as the original. How many copies? Admiral Morrison asked. 17 and counting, came the reply. At this rate, it will have replicated enough times to overwhelm our entire fleet within the hour. Zixathala felt her heart sink as she realized the true scope of what they faced. The Hunters hadn't just evolved to counter human tactics, they had evolved to surpass them entirely. Humanity's 3,000-year preparation might not be enough, but then Captain Martinez did something unexpected. He smiled. Admiral, he said into his communication device, recommend implementation of Protocol Omega. It's time to show them what we learned from Earth's greatest lesson. There was a pause before Morrison's reply came through, his voice carrying a weight that made the air itself seem heavier. Are you certain, Captain? Once we implement Omega, there's no going back. Sir, with respect, there was never any going back, Martinez replied. We always knew this day would come. Time to finish what our ancestors started. Very well. Morrison's voice carried across the entire human fleet. All vessels implement Protocol Omega. Authorization code Darwin 77 Alpha. May God forgive us for what we're about to do. Across the battle zones, human ships began to undergo transformations that made their previous adaptations seem primitive by comparison. Hull plating shifted and flowed like living tissue. Weapon systems merged with their operators through neural interfaces so complete that the boundary between human and machine disappeared entirely. Most disturbing of all, the ships themselves began to exhibit predatory behavior patterns, hunting the hunters with an intelligence that seemed almost alive. "What did you do?" Zixthala asked, horrified and fascinated in equal measure. "We became what Earth taught us to become," Martinez replied, his own body beginning to show subtle changes as his ship's systems integrated with his nervous system. Every species on our homeworld was locked in an evolutionary arms race, constantly adapting to survive against other species that were adapting to kill them. We brought that same principle to space. The hunter that had been replicating itself near Rigel suddenly found itself facing an opponent it couldn't comprehend. The human ships in that system hadn't just adapted to its replication strategy, they had evolved beyond it. Each human vessel was now capable of existing as both individual units and as components of a larger organism, creating tactical flexibility that exceeded even the hunter's reality warping abilities. But the true horror of Protocol Omega became apparent when the first hunter was actually killed by the transformed human fleet. Instead of simply destroying the creature, the human ships began to consume it, breaking down its exotic matter and energy patterns to fuel their own continued evolution. "You're eating them," Zixthala said in shock. "They taught us that everything in the universe is either predator or prey," Martinez replied, his voice now carrying harmonics that suggested his vocal cords had been altered at the molecular level. "We chose to be predators." Across the galaxy, the tide of battle began to shift as humanity revealed the final result of their 3,000-year preparation. They hadn't just developed weapons to fight the hunters. They had evolved themselves into living weapons, creatures of directed evolution capable of adapting to any threat and consuming any enemy. The Void Hunters, ancient beings that had devoured countless galaxies across eons of existence, found themselves facing something they had never encountered, prey that had evolved specifically to hunt them. For the first time in their existence, they experienced something they didn't understand: fear. But in the depths of space, beyond the main battle zones, something else was stirring. The hunters' true leadership, being so ancient and powerful that they had orchestrated the consumption of entire universe clusters, had finally taken notice of the small galaxy that dared to resist them. The real war was about to begin. The arrival of the hunter Primarchs changed everything. Ambassador Zixthala was reviewing evacuation reports when reality itself seemed to hiccup around her. For a moment that lasted eternity, she existed in a state between being and not being, aware of her own consciousness but unable to locate her physical form. When normal existence reasserted itself, she found herself floating in the command center of her ship, along with every other piece of matter not bolted down. "What just happened?" she gasped, struggling to reorient herself as artificial gravity slowly returned. Captain Martinez was at his station, but his appearance had changed dramatically since Protocol Omega's implementation. His skin now showed circuit-like patterns that pulsed with bioluminescent light, and his eyes had become multifaceted like those of an insect, allowing him to process multiple data streams simultaneously. "The Primarchs have arrived," he said, his voice now a harmony of multiple tones. "Being so old they predate the formation of most galaxies. Their mere presence in this reality warps space-time around them. On the tactical displays, new signatures were appearing that dwarfed even the largest hunters they had previously encountered. These weren't creatures that existed partially outside reality. They were entities that defined reality around themselves. Where they moved, the fundamental forces of physics changed to accommodate their presence. "Admiral Morrison to all vessels," came the fleet commander's voice, but even he sounded different now. His consciousness expanded beyond human limitations. "We are now facing Hunter Primarchs, entities that have consumed entire universe clusters. Standard tactics are ineffective. All ships prepare for Transcendence Protocol." "Transcendence?" Zixthala asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Martinez turned to look at her, and she saw something in his transformed features that both terrified and amazed her. It was the look of a being that had willingly sacrificed its own humanity to become something capable of protecting everything it loved. "The final evolution," he explained. "We always knew that defeating the true hunters might require us to become something beyond human. Today we find out if 3,000 years of preparation was enough." Across the fleet, human ships began to undergo transformations that transcended even the radical changes of Protocol Omega. They didn't just merge with their technology, they began to merge with the fundamental forces of the universe itself. Matter and energy became interchangeable. Consciousness expanded to encompass quantum states, and individual identity dissolved into collective awareness, while somehow maintaining personal will. The first engagement between a transcended human vessel and a hunter primarch defied description. It wasn't a battle fought with weapons and shields, but a conflict of competing realities, each side trying to impose its version of existence on the universe around them. Space twisted into impossible geometries. Time flowed backward and forward simultaneously, and causality became a suggestion rather than a law. But humanity had one advantage the Primarchs hadn't anticipated. They remembered what it was like to be small, vulnerable, and afraid. Even transcended, they retained the desperate creativity that came from being prey animals who had learned to hunt. The Primarch in Sector 7 is trying to rewrite local physics to make our ships impossible, reported Dr. Chen. Her consciousness now distributed across multiple vessels simultaneously. It's attempting to define us out of existence. Counter with paradox equations, Morrison commanded. Show it what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object that's also an unstoppable force. What followed was a battle of concepts as much as a battle of forces. The humans didn't just fight the Primarch's attempts to reshape reality. They introduced logical contradictions that forced the ancient beings to waste energy, maintaining coherent existence around impossible scenarios. But the true turning point came when humanity revealed the deepest secret of their transformation. They hadn't just evolved to fight the hunters, they had evolved to understand them. In transcending their physical limitations, they had gained insight into the hunter's fundamental nature. They're afraid, Captain Martinez announced suddenly, his voice filled with wonder. For all their power, for all their age and experience, they're terrified of entropy. They consume matter and energy not out of hunger, but out of fear that the universe will end without them. This revelation changed everything. The hunters weren't apex predators reveling in their power. They were the universe's ultimate prey animals, desperately consuming everything around them to stave off their own inevitable extinction. They had become so focused on survival that they had forgotten why survival mattered. All ships, Admiral Morrison's voice carried a new tone, one that might have been called compassionate if it hadn't come from a being that now existed, partially outside conventional spacetime. Implement the final protocol. Show them what they've forgotten. What happened next would be remembered by every surviving species in the galaxy for the rest of their existence. Instead of destroying the Primarchs, humanity began to show them something they had lost eons ago: the beauty of creation itself. Using their transcended abilities, human consciousness touched the ancient minds of the Primarchs and shared with them memories of what it was like to build rather than consume, to create rather than destroy, to love something enough to sacrifice everything to protect it. They showed them Earth, a small blue world where life had learned to cooperate as well as compete, where intelligence had emerged not to dominate but to understand. The effect on the Primarchs was immediate and profound. Beings that had existed for billions of years suddenly remembered why existence was worth preserving, rather than consuming. The hunger that had driven them to devour galaxies was revealed as a perversion of their original purpose: to be gardeners of reality rather than its destroyers. One by one, the ancient beings began to transform, their dark energy patterns shifting towards something that resembled light. The smaller hunters, sensing the change in their leaders, stopped their advance and began to retreat toward the galactic edge, confusion evident in their movements. In the aftermath of what historians would call the awakening, Ambassador Zixthala found herself in a galaxy forever changed. The immediate threat was over, but humanity's transformation had altered the fundamental balance of power in ways that would take centuries to fully understand. What happens now? She asked Captain Martinez, who was slowly reverting to a more recognizably human form as the crisis protocols were deactivated. Now we rebuild, he replied, looking out at the stars with eyes that had seen beyond the edge of reality itself. The Primarchs have agreed to help repair the damage they caused, and the smaller hunters will need to be taught new purposes. It's going to take time, and humanity? Martinez smiled, and for the first time since the crisis began, it was a fully human expression. We go back to watching and waiting. But this time we won't be alone. The galaxy has learned that sometimes the most dangerous-looking guardians are the ones you want on your side. As the human fleet began to disperse back to their hidden stations throughout the galaxy, Zixthala reflected on what she had witnessed. The species that had begged for help had received salvation from the most unlikely source. The very beings they had feared might be too dangerous to trust. In the end, the Deathworlders had emerged from the shadows not as conquerors, but as protectors who understood that sometimes the only way to preserve life was to become temporarily monstrous in its defense, and in doing so, they had not only saved the galaxy but taught its most ancient enemies to remember the joy of creation over the fear of destruction. The age of hiding was over. The age of cooperation was about to begin.